essay by Today I'm going to read from a lecture that was delivered by Dr. Jung in English at the Institute of Medical Psychology, the Tavistock Clinic in London on October 14th, 1936, when Jung had just returned from his visit to the United States. He had written the lecture during the voyage. According to his daughter Marianne Neuhaus Jung, the text, based on a holograph manuscript, has not been previously published, though similar ideas are found in an interview with Jung in The Observer of London, reprinted in Time on November 9th, 1936, in Living Age in December 1936, and as The Psychology of Dictatorship in C.G. Jung Speaking, which is a collection of books about Dr. Jung's talks. So this is quite a long essay and quite complex, but I think it's important to put it out into the public space again. Obviously, the audience for this lecture in London in Obviously, the audience for the lecture in London was a very small one, and given the limitations on international communications in the 1930s, very few people were exposed to this actual information. And so it seems very important to us today. It's oddly prescient about what our situation in the world and in the United States is today. It's not particularly party-oriented. I'm wearing my purple shirt today to indicate neither red nor blue, and hopefully my fellow Americans will pay some attention to what is being said in this essay. Psychology and national problems. The question of psychology and national problems with which I have been asked to deal is indeed of some topicality. It is, and of course this is 1936. This is 1936 that he's speaking. It is a question, however, that would not have been asked before the World War, that is, before World War I. People in general were not aware of any disturbance in the mental or psychic atmosphere of Europe, although the psychological critic or a philosopher of the antique style could have found enough to talk about. It was a prosperous world then, and one which believed in what the eye saw and the ear heard, and in what rationalism and philosophical positivism had to say. I'm going to read that sentence again. It was a prosperous world then, and one which believed in what the eye saw and the ear heard, and in what rationalism and philosophical positivism had to say. Even the rational possibility of a great war seemed, in spite of historical evidence, a far-fetched and artificial nightmare. Nothing more than a theoretical scarecrow occasionally conjured up by politicians and newspapers when they had nothing else to say. One was thoroughly convinced that international, financial, commercial, and industrial relations were so tightly knit together as to exclude the mere possibility of a war. The Agadir incident and similar gestures seemed to be mere pranks of a psychopathic monarch, otherwise safely enmeshed in an international network of financial obligations whose gigantic proportions were supposed to rule out any attempts of a serious military nature. Now, just for the record, there's a footnote here about the Agadir incident. The arrival of the German warship, the arrival of a German warship at the port of Agadir, Morocco, which precipitated an international crisis in 1911. So that's what he's talking about. He calls it a prank. So, once again, the Agadir incident and similar gestures seem to be mere pranks of a psychopathic monarch, otherwise safely enmeshed in an international network of financial obligations whose gigantic proportions were supposed to rule out any attempts of a serious military nature. Moreover, the fabulous development of science, the high standard of public education in most European countries, and a public opinion organized as never before in history, allowed European humanity to believe in man's conscious achievements, in his reason, intelligence, and willpower. It almost appeared as if man and his ideals were going to possess the earth and rule it wisely for the welfare of all peoples. Well, we know how that turned out. The World War has shattered this dream and has crushed most of the ideals preceding. Okay, when he's talking about the World War, he's talking about World War I. The World War has shattered this dream and has crushed most of the ideals of the preceding era. The World War has shattered this dream and has crushed most of the ideals of the preceding era. In this post-war mood originated the doubt: is everything all right with the human mind? One began to question its sanity because thinking people grew more and more astonished at all the things humanity could do. The benevolent God of science that had done such marvelous things for the benefit of man had uncovered his dark face. He produced the most diabolical war machinery, including the abomination of poison gases, and human reason got more and more obscured by strange and absurd ideas. International relations turned into the most exaggerated nationalism, and the very God of the earth, the ultima ratio of all things worldly, money, developed a more and more fictitious character never dreamt of before. Not only the security of the gold standard, but also the treaties and other international arrangements, already badly shaken by the war, did not recover but became increasingly illusory. Nearly all major attempts at reduction of armaments and its stabilization of international finances went wrong. Sean, just for the record, my Twitter ID is skip_Conover. Let me just put it here so you can see. There it is. Okay, carrying on. This is quite a long essay, so it's going to take a couple of hours to read. Slowly it dawned on mankind that it was caught in one of the worst moral crises the world had ever known. It is natural enough that in many quarters the doubt arose as to whether the human mind had not changed. It did not appear preposterous anymore to assume that possibly there were peculiar psychological reasons for all these disquieting developments which otherwise could hardly be explained. Many people wondered what psychology would have to say about the world situation. Such questions, as a matter of fact, have often been put to me, and I must confess I always felt not only definitely uncomfortable, but singularly incompetent to give a satisfactory answer. The subject is really too complicated. The predominant and immediate reasons for the crisis are factors of an economic and political nature. Inasmuch as these are activities of the human mind, they should be subject to certain psychological laws. But the economic factors especially are not wholly psychological in character. They depend to a great extent on conditions that can hardly be linked up with psychology. I think today we can say that economic factors can be linked up to psychology, but in 1936, this is where Dr. Jung was. In politics, on the other hand, psychology seems to prevail, but there is an ultimate factor of numbers, of sheer force and violence, that corresponds to a caveman's or an animal's psychology rather than anything human. There is no psychology yet of such infinitely complex matters as economics or politics. We certainly need that. So if any of you are in university and are looking for something to get a PhD in, this would be a good topic. Okay, so there is no psychology yet of such infinitely complex matters as economics and psychology. There is no psychology yet of such infinitely complex matters as economics or politics. It is still quite questionable whether there is any hope at all that psychology can be applied to things due to non-psychological factors. At least that was the view in his time. Psychology's come quite a long way in the last 82 years. I don't consider myself competent to deal with the ultimate meaning of our world crisis. There are certain sides to it, however, that possess a definitely psychological aspect, offering an opportunity for comment. It seems to be within the reach of contemporary psychology to produce a certain point of view, at least. Before entering upon this subject, I would like to say a few words about psychology in general. Now, the few words that he was talking about. There was a view graph. In 1936, he was using a view graph, and so this is the simple graph that he was using. Psychology in 3 layers: conscious, subconscious, and collective unconscious. But I think later in his career he really stopped using the term subconscious and simply called it unconscious, human unconscious, and then collective unconscious relating to the mass, whether it's a group, a state, or humanity in general. Having given you a short account of what I understand psychology consists of, let me turn now to our subject. First of all, a negative statement. I exclude from psychological consideration the strictly economic and political aspect of present-day events. My response to that was, whoa, we can't take economic and psychological or economic and political issues out of the mix. These days we have to consider everything as a whole. But at that time, Dr. Jung, who was a Swiss German and was speaking in London, was being careful. So he says, First of all, a negative statement. I exclude from psychological consideration the strictly economic and political aspect of present-day events. I am doing this because they are, partly at least, non-psychological. Whatever the psychological reasons for the Great War may have been, they transcend my psychological competence. At least they transcended it as of 1936. I shall concern myself chiefly with the psychological situation brought about by the war, and he's talking about World War I here. That there is a so-called psychological situation at all appears to be borne out by a great number of phenomena that there is a so-called psychological situation at all appears to be borne out by a great number of phenomena which we have to call symptoms. You call a certain phenomenon a symptom when it is obvious that it does not function as a logical means to an end, but rather stands out as a mere result of chiefly causal conditions without any obvious purposiveness. Thus the yellow color of the skin in a case of jaundice is a phenomenon with no purposiveness, and we therefore call it a symptom, as contrasted with the war paint of a Red Indian, which is a purposive part of the war ceremonial. Yeah, Sean, I don't quite follow your point there at the end. You would assume it would have some active element that he differentiated it initially. He may have done. I'm just reading what I see on the page here. Or a man drives a nail into the wall and we ask him why he is doing it. If he answers that it is to hang his coat there, then what he does is purposive because it makes sense. But if he answers that it is because he happened to hold a hammer and a nail in his hands, then his action is a symptom, or at least he wants it to appear as such. Nonetheless, we could imagine mass organizations without the Likewise, we could imagine mass organizations without the Roman salute, lictor bundles, swastikas, neo-paganism, and other paraphernalia, because our political parties, as well as Standard Oil or Dutch Shell, can do without them. Therefore, it appears to us as if such peculiarities were chiefly symptoms of a particular causal condition of the mind. On the other hand, we know that symbols and ceremonies mainly occur in religious organizations where it is indeed a matter of a peculiar mental state. Of course, if you are in that frame of mind, you would not think of symptomology. On the contrary, you would call those peculiarities purposive and meaningful because to you they appear to serve a definite end. As long as one is within a certain phenomenology, one is not astonished and nobody wonders what it is all about. Such philosophical doubt only comes to the man who is outside the game. The countries where the most remarkable symptoms occur are chiefly those that have been actually at war and have therefore found themselves afterwards in a state of appalling misery and disorder. I mean particularly Russia, Germany, Austria, and Italy. No matter what the cause, misery is a definite psychological condition characterized by definite emotions, such as depression, fear, despair, insecurity, unrest, and resentments of every description. Since our empirical psychology is based entirely on the experience of individual cases, our argument must necessarily start from the individual. This leads us to the question, what will an individual do when under the strain of acute misery? There is a positive and a negative reaction to such a condition. 1. Positive. A greater effort is called forth. The individual will show more strength and willpower and will try to overcome the obstacle or the cause of misery through physical, intellectual, and moral effort. It will be an entirely conscious and rational attempt supported by all the means at an individual's disposal. If the strength of one individual is not sufficient, he will seek the help of others. Perhaps a greater number of individuals will form some sort of organization in order to remove the cause of suffering. If such an ultimate attempt fails, or if an individual is too weak from the start to show fight, then a negative reaction takes place. 2. Negative. Instead of suitable measures of defense, and instead of a concentration of energy, of efforts of the will, and of all rational ways and methods applicable to such a condition, an emotional reaction will take place. Emotional reaction always denotes an inferior adjustment. This does not necessarily mean the adjustment is ineffectual. It merely denotes that if the individual comes through successfully, the success is due to the fact that he has been passively carried through on the crest of an emotional wave rather than by conscious and deliberate effort of the will. In other words, the success has been reached in a primitive and inferior way, in the main through a merely instinctive reaction. But more often the emotional reaction is not successful just because it is too primitive and therefore a maladjustment to a perhaps highly complicated situation. In either case, the individual is passive and he is more the object of the emotion than its subject. The emotional reaction, as a rule, consists of depression, fear, and even panic. Emotional conditions always call up instinctive reactions. The hierarchy of human reason becomes weakened and disintegrated, leaving a door open for the intrusion of primitive instinctive forces. Emotional reaction always means regression. The first effect of regression is, as a rule, the reawakening of infantile methods and attitudes. People under the influence of fear and despair very often become infantile, exaggeratedly helpless and demoralized. Helplessness and panic also lead to group formation, or rather to a clustering together in masses for the sake of gregarious security. There's a footnote here. As examples of regression, presumably elaborated in the lecture, the holograph itemizes, and by holograph I think they mean a transparency that was being displayed. So it itemizes 1, father and mother complex, 2, complex of infantile religion, 3, regression to infantile criminality, 4, regression to archetypes, which are schizophrenia, mystical experience, and analytical experience. So regression to archetypes. Group formation under the influence of panic cannot be called an organization because it is not an attempt based on reason and will, but on a fundamental emotional movement. Because it is not an attempt based on reason and will, but on a fundamentally emotional movement. It is an accumulation rather than an organization. Such group formations all show unmistakable traces of infantile and archaic psychology. Infantile inasmuch as they always look for the father, and archaic inasmuch as the father image appears in a mythical setting. It seems to be unavoidable that such group formations regress to primitive tribal associations that are held together on the one hand by a chief or medicine man, and on the other by a sort of mystical doctrine, the tribal teaching. We turn now to the question, what would a nation do when in a state of psychological mystery? We turn now to the question, what would a nation do when in a state of psychological misery? Since a multitude of people or a nation is nothing but an accumulation of individuals, its psychology is likewise an accumulation of individual psychologies. The individual psyche, however, is characterized by individual differences, partly congenital, partly acquired. Nearly every individual shows certain specific achievements which add to his relative uniqueness. On the other hand, each individual is partly similar to any other, a fact that produces the aspect of human equality. Thus, individuals are like each other inasmuch as they have qualities in no way different from those of others, but unlike each other inasmuch as they develop qualities and achievements that cannot be compared with those of other people. Whatever people have in common can accumulate in a group formation, but their individual achievements never accumulate, rather they extinguish each other. Thus, a large group, considered as one being, exhibits merely the traits common to all people, but none of their individual achievements. The traits common to all people consist chiefly of instinctual qualities. These are of relatively primitive character and indubitably inferior in comparison with the mental level of most of the members of the group. Thus, 100 intelligent people together make one hydrocephalus. Oh, the man had a way of talking. Let's see. Sean says, you would assume it would have some active element in that he differentiated it initially. Sean goes on, I was just thinking that intuition as a component of mechanism would be able to operate at substrate level rather than full consciousness. It makes me think of the utility of subconscious. Yes, that's true. I think it has been established recently that we can only hold something like I think it might be 40 kilobits in our conscious mind at any given time, but we have lots of stuff in our deep unconscious. So I'm going to reread those last two sentences in that paragraph. That was paragraph 1314 if you're looking for it. Thus 100 intelligent people together make one hydrocephalus. The psychology of masses is always inferior, even in their most idealistic enterprises. The whole of a nation never reacts like a normal modern individual, but always like a primitive group being. Therefore, masses are never properly adjusted except on very primitive levels. Their reactions belong to our second category, the negative form. Man in the group is always unreasonable, irresponsible, emotional, erratic, and unreliable. Crimes the individual alone could never stand are freely committed by the group being. A society woman would rather die than appear at a dinner in an obscene dress, but if it were the fashion in the group, she would not hesitate for a second to put on the most shocking monstrosity. Think for a moment of the famous Cour de Paris that embellished the youth of our older generation. The men are no better. The larger an organization, the lower its morality. The leader of a great religious movement, when caught out in a lie, said, "Oh, for Christ, you may even lie." Paragraph 1316. Nations being the largest organized groups are, from a psychological point of view, clumsy, stupid, and amoral monsters, like those huge saurians with an incredibly small brain. I think he's referring to dinosaurs here. They are inaccessible to reasonable argument. They are suggestible like hysterical patients. They are childish and moody, helpless victims of their emotions. Where have we seen that lately? They are caught in every swindle called slogans. They are stupid to an amazing degree. They are greedy, reckless, and blindly violent, like a rhino suddenly aroused from sleep. They persevere in every nonsense, in every emotion and resentment, in every prejudice, far beyond the psychological moment, and they get ensnared by the cheapest of all obvious tricks. Most of the time they live in dreams and primitive illusions, usually rigged out as isms. As long as they can feed on open ground in an undisturbed way, they are sleepy and harmless. But if their food gets scarce and they begin to migrate or to encroach upon neighboring territory, they resort to violence. They are not to be convinced that human beings are evolved. They are not to be convinced that human beings have evolved much better methods in many thousands of years, and that these individual men believe in reason and intelligence. Monster groups have a natural leaning to leaders. But a leader always means a group within the nation, and such a group is more greedy and eats more than the other groups it leads. And as all greedy monsters are jealous, they get rid of their leaders and call the new condition a democracy, in which nobody rules and nobody is ruled. The logic... okay, I'm going to read that again. Monster groups have a natural leaning to leaders, but a leader always means a group within the nation, and such a group is more greedy and eats more than the other groups it leads. And as all greedy monsters are jealous, They get rid of their leaders and call the new condition a democracy in which nobody rules and nobody is ruled. The logic of this procedure closely resembles the story of the man who got stranded on an uninhabited island. The first thing he did was an act of statesmanship. He called himself a democracy and consequently felt extraordinarily free and in full possession of all political rights. Even a group being can't help noticing that in living in a democracy, you run your head against remarkably unintelligent restrictions of freedom imposed upon each free, self-ruling citizen by an invisible, wholly legendary being called the state. I'll read that once again. Even a group being can't help noticing that in living in a democracy, you run your head against remarkably unintelligent restrictions to freedom imposed upon each free, self-ruling citizen by an invisible, wholly legendary being called the state. When a monster group first called itself a democracy, it surely did not think that its former ruler, now dethroned, would turn into a ghost. Yet he did. He became the state. The state is the psychological mirror image of the democracy. The state is the psychological mirror image of the democracy monster. As the nation always rises as one man, the state is just as good as one man. As a matter of fact, it is quite a person of unlimited means. More exacting than any tyrant ever was, greedy to the limit and biologically dangerous. It, the state, is not like a Roman Caesar, enslaving prisoners of war in the lower strata of the population. It squeezes its contributions out of the most vital and most gifted individuals of its domain, making slaves of them for its own wasteful devices. It does not know that energy only works when accumulated. Its energy is money. It taps all carefully prepared and studied accumulations of this energy and dissipates it so that it becomes ineffectual, thereby causing an artificial entropy. Okay. Space Battleship says, sounds like politics in 2018 on Twitter. Yep. Yes, and Sean says, I feel a lot of dichotomy in these few lines. Absolutely. That's why I'm reading this, because this is just incredibly on about not only what was happening in 1936, but what is happening to us today. Paragraph 1320. It seems that democracy was a suitable name only in the very youth of the state ghost. In order to support its boundless ambitions, two brand new isms had to be invented: socialism and communism. They enhance its ultra-democratic character to an extraordinary degree. The man on the lonely island is now the communistic social democracy. Let me clear my throat and read that again. So he's talking about isms, and specifically the isms of socialism and communism. But he's pointing out that these are just extremes of democracy. In order to support its boundless ambitions, two brand new isms had to be invented, socialism and communism. They enhanced its ultra-democratic character to an extraordinary degree. The man on the lonely the man on the lonely island is now the communistic social democracy. Together with these illusions goes another helpful procedure, the hollowing out of money, which in the near future will make all savings illusory and, along with cultural continuity, guaranteed by individual responsibility. The state takes over responsibility and enslaves every individual for its own ridiculous schemes. All this is done by what one calls inflation, devaluation, and most recently dilution, which you should not mix up with the unpopular term inflation. Dilution is now the right word, and only idiots can't see the striking difference between this concept and inflation. Money value is fast becoming a fiction guaranteed by the state. Money becomes paper, and everybody convinces everybody else that the little scraps are worth something because the state says so. I am by no means sure that what I am saying is not fictitious too. I don't know exactly what has gone wrong, but I have a strong and most uncomfortable feeling that something has gone wrong, and it is even getting worse. This is Dr. Jung giving a lecture in 1936. I am also certain that I am not the only one to experience such a feeling. There must be hundreds of people who have lost their confidence in the direction in which things are apparently moving. As group beings are all befogged in the same way, but as individuals we might as well apply as much of our psychiatric knowledge as seems to befit the peculiar symptomology of our bewildering epoch. As I mentioned at the beginning, we find the symptoms chiefly in those nations that have been mangled by the We find the symptoms chiefly in those nations that have been mangled the most by the war beast. There is, for instance, the German case. As far back as 1918, I published a paper in which I called attention to my contemporaries to an astounding development in the German edition of the Collective Unconscious. I had caught hold of certain collective dreams of Germans, which convinced me that they portrayed the beginning of a national regression analogous to the regression of a frightened and helpless individual, becoming first infantile and then primitive or archaic. I saw Nietzsche's blonde beast looming up with all that it implies. I felt sure that Christianity would be challenged and that the Jews would be taken to account. I therefore tried to start the discussion in order to forestall the inevitable violence of the unconscious outburst, of which I was afraid, though not enough, as subsequent events have unfortunately shown only too clearly. I don't need to say that I was not heard. The fog of war psychology was just too dense. Germany was the first country to experience the miracles Gotta get my mouth around his his words. Germany was the first country to experience the miracles worked by democracy's ghost, the state. She saw her money becoming elastic and expanding to astronomical proportions and then evaporating altogether. She experienced all in one heap what the ghosts of other democracies are trying to do to us in a sort of slow motion picture. Probably hoping that nobody understands the eyewash. Okay. I'll read that again. She experienced all in one heap what the ghosts of other democracies are trying to do to us in a sort of slow motion picture, probably hoping that nobody understands the eyewash. Germany got it right in the neck, and there was no joke about it. Good morning, Death Metal Mason. Thomas says, political psychology seems to be an interdisciplinary field of study offered in some universities. Gustave Le Bon was one of the pioneers of this field, the crowd, a study of the popular mind. And I urge everyone who's listening to read Crowds and Power by Elias, what is his last name? I think it's Elias Canetti, but I'm not sure that's correct. But anyway, the book is called Crowds and Power, and it's a frightening book, absolutely. Reading on, the whole educated middle class was utterly ruined, but the state was on top, putting on more and more of its istic rouge as war paint. The country was in a condition of extreme misery and insecurity, and waves of panic swept over the population. In an individual case, these are symptoms of an oncoming outburst. Any such outburst would bring up archaic material, archetypes that join forces with the individual as well as with the people. There is some teleology about this. It creates strength where there was weakness, conviction instead of doubt, courage instead of fear. But the energy needed to bring about such a transformation is taken away from many old values, and the success gained is paid for dearly. Such an outburst is always a regression into history, and it always means a lowering of the level of civilization. Paragraph 1324. Through communism in Russia, through National Socialism in Germany, through fascism in Italy, the state became all-powerful and claimed its slaves, body and soul. Democracy became its own mirror image, its own ghost, while the ghost became appallingly real and all-embracing mystical presence and personality that usurped the throne of pious theocratic Christianity had hoped God would take. I'll read that paragraph again. Democracy became its own mirror image, its own ghost, while the ghost became appallingly real and all-embracing mystical presence and personality that usurped the throne of pious theocratic Christianity had hoped God would take. The old totalitarian claim of the Civitas Dei is now voiced by the state. One sheep is as good as another, and the whole herd crowded together, guarded by plain-clothed and uniformed wolf dogs, utterly deprived of all the rights which the man on the island who called himself a democracy had dreamt of. There are no rights left, only duties. Cheery, huh? Don't worry, I only have 17 more pages of this to read. By the way, I'm grateful to Louis LaFontaine, who brought this essay to my attention in this mailing, which came from the Carl Jung Depth Psychology site blog, which he maintains and from which he sends emails on a daily basis. So yesterday he sent me this and said he thought it might be interesting for current events, and so it is, and therefore I'm reading it to you. Continuing on, every source of energy, industry, commerce, money, even private enterprise is sucked up into the new slave owner, the state, and a new miracle happened. Out of nowhere, certain men came, and each of them said, like Louis XIV, "L'État, c'est moi." The state is me. They are the new leaders. The state has proved its personal reality by incarnating itself in men that came from Galilee, inconspicuous nobodies previously, but equipped with the great spirit voice that cowed the people into soundless obedience. They are like Roman Caesars, usurpers of empires and kingdoms, and like those incarnations of a previously invisible deity, devoutly invoked and believed in by everybody. They are the state that has superseded the medieval theocracy. This process of incarnation is particularly drastic in Hitler's case. Hitler himself, as an ordinary person, is a shy and friendly man with artistic tastes and gifts. Paragraph 1326. As a mere man, he is inoffensive and modest and has nice eyes, but he comes from Braunau, a little town that has already produced two famous mediums, the Schneider brothers. Harry Price has written a book about one of them. Hitler is presumably the third and most efficient medium from Braunau. When the state spirit speaks through him, he sends forth a voice of thunder, and his word is so powerful that it sweeps together the crowds of millions like fallen autumn leaves. This is obviously no power. Paragraph 1327. There is obviously no power left in the world, and particularly no state-loving ism, which is capable of resisting this incredible force. This is Dr. Jung speaking to a psychiatric group in London in 1936. Of course, you will say, as everybody does, quote, "One must be a German to understand such miracles," unquote. Yes, this is just as true as that you must be an Italian to understand the mythology of the Fascio, or a Russian to appreciate the charms of Stalin's paternal regime. Of course, you can't understand these funny foreigners, Sir Oswald Mosley and Colonel de la Roque, being still babes in arms. And the footnote says that they were promoting black shirts in Britain, and I don't know where de la Roque was, France, I suppose. But if you carefully study what President Roosevelt is up to and what the famous NRA meant to the world of American commerce and industry, then you get a certain idea of how near the great state in America is becoming Roosevelt's incarnation. And here he's referring not to the National Rifle Association, but to the National Recovery Act, and which was called the NRA back in the 30s, and which gave the president powers to confiscate and put martial law into effect and that sort of thing. Somehow my streaming seems to be off. I don't know why. Okay. Is my audio still coming through all right for everyone? If it is, I'll just keep talking and ignore what I'm seeing on my screen. If not, I'm going to stop for about 1 minute while I reboot. Can anybody hear me? Okay. Okay, I'm going to stop this broadcast for 1